Hi, welcome to Deepfakery, a new web series of critical conversations exploring art, human rights, journalism, and deepfakes, all in a time of infodemics. I'm Corin Fife, Program Coordinator for Emerging Threats and Opportunities at Witness. And for those who are new to the series and to Witness, we're a human rights organization that works with people who use video and technology to secure social justice.
I'm Kat Cizek. I'm the artistic director of the co-creation studio at MIT Open Documentary Lab. And this series is a joint presentation between our two groups. And we are supported by Knight Foundation with our media partners, BuzzFeed and Vimeo. We've come together to examine the deepfake technologies, their uses, misuses in art, journalism, and documentary. For those of you who are not familiar with deepfakes, we're talking about new ways to use artificial intelligence to make it look like someone said something or did something that they never did by swapping out their faces, simulating voices, or even manipulating scenes. Today's episode is called Manipulating Memories, Archives, History, and Deepfakes, and it's moderated by William Uricchio, Professor of Comparative Media Studies at MIT and Principal Investigator of both the MIT Open Documentary Lab and the Co-Creation Studio. Everyone's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and we're going to have time at the end for your questions. And so please do drop them into the socials that you're in, and we'll be sure to pick them up and bring them back to the guests today. So now it's my honor to pass this over to our moderator and my colleague, William Uricchio.
Thank you very much, Kat. Some of you might recall seeing images of Forrest Gump meeting Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, or maybe Woody Allen in an earlier film, Zelig, peering over the shoulder of Adolf Hitler. And one wonders if someday one of these images is going to wind up in someone's archival search. From the start, archives and historians have been busy spotting fakes and forgeries, purging them from the system. And while every existing medium has been used to create fakes, deepfakes' speed of production and rapidly increasing accessibility as a technology are game changers. So in our discussion today, the issue of archival pollution in the age of deepfake will loom large. However, there are other crucial questions. The authenticity presumed and preserved by archivists is important, but it also poses a problem. If we don't save the inauthentic, if we don't save the tricks and the frauds, how are we shaping our cultural memory? How will we learn from the past? Better understanding how archives deal with this complicated material and whether we need to develop new and more pointed strategies to handle it, particularly as synthetic media challenge our verification systems, are pressing. An even more fundamental question deals with the very roots of the Greek word behind archive, arche. Arche refers to governance, the system at the heart of an organization. What we save is fundamental to our cultural memory, the basis, if you will, of our social operating system. There's a relevant parallel here for the training sets that are used to develop deepfakes. Training sets dictate the limits of what code can do, and in so doing, effectively play a role in the governance of whatever is created. Training sets are one of the more insidious ways that bias creeps into the system. Yes, even deepfakes are culturally biased. And to come full circle, widely used training sets such as ImageNet with all of their demographic biases will provide crucial evidence for future historians. Should we archive these training sets? Are we archiving them? And why not? To help answer these questions, I'm going to be joined today by four guests. From Seattle, James Coop, an artist who works with, among other things, generative adversarial networks, and who's professor of digital art and experimental media at the University of Washington, and 2020 ThoughtWorks synthetic media resident. From London, Francesca Panetta, an artist, director, and journalist with a long history in emerging media at The Guardian. Fran is currently creative director at the MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality, where together with the next person I'm going to introduce, Halsey Burgund, she created In Event of Moon Disaster. Halsey Burgund, based in Cambridge, Mass., is a sound artist, technologist, and among other things, creator of Roundware. an open source contributory audio AR platform. Halsey was Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow and is currently a fellow at the MIT Open Doc Lab. And finally, we come to Yvonne Ng, who is in Prague and is an audiovisual archivist and manager of Witnesses Archive of Human Rights Video. She also develops training resources related to archiving and preservation, such as the groundbreaking Activist Guide to Archiving Video. I'm going to start off with a question for each speaker to kind of get a sense of where they're coming from, what keeps them up at night, particularly as it pertains to our topic of manipulating memories. And then we'll open things up for a group discussion before going on to your questions from the audience. Okay, let's turn over to James. And to introduce James, I'm going to start with actually a clip from his Warriors project, and then James can help us unpack it and locate his work. So let's take a look at the clip from Warriors.
Artist James Coop's new work at the International Center of Photography is a piece called Warriors. It uses manipulated videos, known as deep fakes, to superimpose the likenesses of museum visitors into movie scenes. Any visitor who walks in the museum's door is fair game for a starring role. You walk into the museum and are invited to submit a photo of your face on one of the iPads stationed around the room. A computer thoroughly analyzes this data using a technique called deep learning. Once your facial attributes have been cataloged, they'll be mapped onto a select character from the 1979 cult film The Warriors. All of a sudden, it's your face on the movie screens, moving and speaking and replicating the original plot.
James, can you tell us a bit about this project, how it relates to your bigger, the bigger arc of your work, and how you've been exploring the technologies and issues bound up in deepfakes?
Sure. Thanks, William. Well, I'm an artist who's been working with new media for a long time, and lately this has pivoted into working with synthetic media tools like deepfakes. Important themes in my work are surveillance, visibility, algorithmic bias. So I'm interested in who's seen, who sees us, how our personal data gets exploited and shared, and how in an age of automation and social networks, we increasingly associate visibility with being meaningful. So when I think about deepfakes, I'm often thinking about visibility. To me, it's a technology that reinforces processes like surrogacy, displacement, mimicry, erasure. It's also inherently archival, although often when we think about AI and machine learning, we think about it in terms of what it authors, like a piece of writing or a video or an image or so on. But ultimately, these are technologies that rely on large collections of photographs or writings or audio recordings before they can generate anything. And this is certainly the case with Warriors, which, although it uses deepfake technologies and replaces characters in the original movie with the faces of people who visit the museum, it's also working with large amounts of image data that it captures and archives and classifies. So it's at least equally concerned with identity and the contested classifications of race and gender and class that are encoded into technological systems and algorithms. So Warriors uses ImageNet to categorize and profile its visitors, and then puts them into gangs based upon how the algorithms see them. ImageNet is one of the most prominent image classifiers used by AI systems. It's a data set of over 14 million images that have been manually annotated by crowd workers. And when an AI model gets trained on ImageNet, it can then look at a photo of a person and decide how to label them. It might see them as a cheerleader or a protester or a senator based upon the photo's similarity to the images in the categories defined by ImageNet. So in other words, these systems reproduce historical bias at a mass scale. And that's something that in Warriors I wanted to make very visible by using deepfakes. So as much as it's interesting from a technical point of view to deepfake somebody, the more important question for me in this work was, whose body and face are we replacing? How does the algorithm see me? Does it see me? And who will I be categorized with? So in the case of Warriors, which gang am I going to be in?
Great. Thanks, James. Okay, let's jump over to Fran and Halsey. You're in event of moon disaster, which we're going to take a look at in a second, launched last November at IDFA in Amsterdam, and then morphed online just in time for COVID. What great timing. Let's take a look at a clip from behind the scenes of an event of moon disaster, and then we can talk about it.
All Secret Service, is there any Secret Service in the room?
Okay, I'm gonna roll.
Have you got an extra camera in case the lights go out?
All right, this is take 3.3.
2.3.
Sorry, 2.3, good God.
Good evening.
Good evening, my fellow Americans.
This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office.
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come
will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Good night.
I think that'll do.
Great. Could you talk a little about the project, give us a context here, and then say something perhaps about how this was received both as an installation and online?
Absolutely. So, in event of moon disaster is the name of a memo that was written for Richard Nixon if the Apollo 11 mission hadn't been successful and if the astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin hadn't been able to return back to Earth. So this was a speech written for him to broadcast if things had gone wrong. And what we've done is taken this piece of documentary archive and brought it to life using synthetic media. And so, as you just alluded to, it's a physical installation, and it's also a 7-minute film which lives on our website. So it has a number of manifestations and different contexts. Maybe Halsey, you can say about those contexts and how they were received.
Sure. I think that it's safe to say that some of the initial reactions we got with the physical installation were some confusion. I think that people are just not really primed for the world of deepfakes yet necessarily, and there's this sort of cognitive dissonance. I think that comes when you see something and hear something. Your eyes and ears are telling you one thing, but at the same time, you know at your core that it is not true that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were stranded on the moon. You know this didn't happen, but you're seeing the president of the United States at the time telling you this in a very somber and earnest way. And I think that people have been very, very confused by that, which is something that we want to help unwind that confusion by giving people a behind the scenes look, as you saw in that trailer before, showing people a little bit about how we made the project, how we created the deepfake, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I think a lot of confusion and then a lot of interest. People have been very curious about these new technologies and about how artificial intelligence can, impact our daily lives, and are, I think, appreciative to understand that this is something that we all need to watch out for. So the website has been it's been getting a lot of views, and we've had close to 1 million views of the film, the deepfake, which has been great. We actually have a quiz on the website which tries to sort of surface the 4 different aspects of the film that are crucial to us to understand whether people know if they're real or fake. Those being the speech, the text of the speech, which of course is real, as Fran mentioned. President Nixon's face, which of course has been manipulated, so that's fake. His voice, which has also been manipulated. also fake. And then finally, the archival footage, which is actually real. All of the space footage, just footage from the capsule and everything. It's all, we've combined the real and the fake to give this particularly, perhaps disturbing in some ways, combination.
Great. Well, thank you, Fran and Halsey. And now let's turn over to Yvonne for a question about the archives. Yvonne, having just heard that, what keeps you up at night as an archivist? Is it corruption of the records, loss of authenticity, a changing role for archives, or something else?
Oh, thanks, William, and honored to be here. I guess coming from the human rights world, I think the broader category of mis or disinformation, or what we call shallow fakes, is definitely something that keeps me up at night. And I guess, fortunately, deepfakes aren't keeping me up quite yet. With deepfakes, the approach that we've been advocating for at Witness is sort of one of prepare but not panic, recognizing the potential harm that deepfakes can have, but seeing that more as an evolution, more than a rupture, and something that we're able to adjust to and deal with. I think for archives, one concern is that trust can be eroded if deepfakes start finding their way into archives undetected being the key word here. Because of the controlled way that records are typically acquired, archives generally presume authenticity of materials, and archives work to maintain that authenticity through their work of preservation, description, and arrangement. And users don't usually see this process, but they assume that the records they access are authentic because they trust that the archive is doing their work properly. So I think archives do need to be aware of bad actors who may try to capitalize or weaponize that hard-earned archival trust. And as archivists, we need to evolve our methods to appropriately identify and describe all forms of misinformation, including deepfakes, that we preserve. I think my worries are tempered, at least, by the fact that trust in archives has sustained over centuries, despite the existence and discovery of fakes and forgeries over time. Also, as a member of the archival community, I see that we're always working to figure out new strategies for dealing with all kinds of new formats, content types, and media. I see that we can be self-reflexive and willing to take a critical look at our collections and seeing how we've arranged and described things in the past and how to correct mistakes. And then finally, I'm also seeing a proliferation of archives and archival thinking in a lot of non-traditional spaces that are actually closer to the record's original context and that are more embedded in those communities than ever before, which I think actually makes it easier to verify information and to detect fakes.
Great. Well, thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, let's, now that we know something about everyone here and their work, let's pull back and open things up for a bigger discussion. I started my intro with a reference to Zelig and Forrest Gump, but of course history is full of fakes. Every medium has been used to make frauds. So is deepfake simply more and faster? If we use it in the narrow sense of deep machine learning based systems, what's there? Is there something there that's fundamentally different from that deeper history of fakes? James, maybe you can start us off.
Sure. Well, yes, on the one hand, deepfakes are part of a long history of audio-visual manipulation that forces us to question truth and facts and reliability of information. But it's also important to track its origins beyond that. So in November 2017, there's a Reddit user named Deepfakes who uploaded videos of celebrity faces and grafted them onto porn actors' bodies. So as is often the case, what we see here is a link between the development of new digital tools and their application as instruments of exploitation. And as deepfakes get instrumentalized by election campaigns, we kind of see some of these patterns occurring. But we might also see deepfakes a little differently. Well, say, something like the internet grew out of a military research project. Deepfakes is perhaps a more kind of grassroots open source technology, and also one that potentially presents serious problems for governments and news media and so on. And if you have a little bit of coding experience in the right kind of computer, you can make a deepfake. So the question we're at is kind of a crossroads, if you like. Which way do we go? Is it going to be an instrument that we can use to push back and think about things like truth and facts and inequality and so on in a different kind of way?
Anyone else?
I guess in our project, we've been trying to think about misinformation in a kind of in a broader context. So, when you ask about the kind of the difference between the deep fake technologies compared to the other misinformation, I think that one of the reasons we tried to incorporate lots of kind of cheap fake techniques into our project was really to try and highlight the kind of similarities, actually, of how misinformation has been used to deceive in the past, and also how I think the general public don't really see a massive difference at the moment. That kind of what's true, which bits are true, which tiny bit of audio has been added here, or whether something's been slowed down, or whether it's algorithmic or not. At the moment, I don't think people are really discerning that, and not to say that means there isn't a difference, but certainly I think in the public's mind there isn't a great difference. And I think we were trying to show this kind of the kind of wide, broad range of techniques that can kind of almost be merged together, real, unreal, cheap, deep, into this kind of mush of misinformation that people often can't see, which bits are real and which aren't. And so anyway, I think that's interesting in terms of when we're thinking about, at least, as a journalist myself as well, like what the headlines are. Is it just about deepfakery? Probably not at the moment.
And
yeah, I would agree with my. Sorry, I would just agree with Fran and James in terms of seeing this on a continuum, not just in terms of fakes and forgeries and misinformation, but also in the continuum of time-based media artworks like these two projects that we just looked at. And although I do think there are new challenges presented by like this deep machine learning, and I think one question that we might touch upon later is like, how do we archive all of these? And I'm actually really curious to hear from, the artists on this panel, but what the preservation plans are for their time-based media projects that are also deepfake projects, if we have time to talk about that.
And it seems to me to raise real questions of literacy. And maybe we're at a moment where the more exposure we have, and that's so great about the project Innovative Mood Disaster, the more exposure, maybe the more discerning we'll be as a public. These questions are emerging at a really, I think, interesting moment, a moment that might be described as epistemological vertigo in the larger culture, a moment when our political leaders are talking about alternate facts, or when we have a leader who tells us that what you're reading is not happening. It's a moment where a lot of certainty about what is and what isn't is up for grabs. What is this going to mean for the archive of the future? How are we going to help to discriminate among the documents that are, especially at this transitional moment when there are varying degrees of authenticity and belief in documents? What's the archive? How does the archive respond to that? Yvonne.
Well, I think it's precisely because of this epistemic vertigo that you're talking about, William, that I think institutions like archives are, as important as ever. And I just wanted to say that, this is not to say that archives are or ever have been like objective preservers of truth, similar to what James mentioned in terms of the training sets. And you mentioned in the introduction, like the root of the word archives. So archives are places, they're situated, they're guarded sites of authority and power, right? And throughout history, they've reflected the worldview and the knowledge systems of whoever it is that controls that particular archive and what they select to keep like in how they describe and manage their records and who they give access to those records to. Just look at the records of indigenous people or colonized people in various national archives around the world, for example. So, with all of this in mind, I still think that archives play a really important role in sort of grounding us during this like epistemic vertigo. While they will always necessarily reflect a certain perspective, the records in an archive are supposed to be fixed. They're supposed to be what they purport to be. They're supposed to be authentic and serve as a document of something that actually happened, even if what actually happened is I made a deep fake. Right? They kind of affirm of existence. And I think maybe this is why we're seeing the emergence of so many community-based archival initiatives now, all over the world, especially coming from the world that I work in human rights. Communities creating their own archives to affirm and provide evidence of their own existence, of their lived experiences, sort of an expression of like, this really happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Just a reminder to the folks viewing out there, please put your questions on whatever social media channels you're watching. We're going to get to your questions pretty soon. A project like In Event of Moon Disaster relies really heavily on archival materials, images of Nixon, sound material from Nixon. Nixon was a public figure, and of course, special rules applied to public figures. But more generally, how should we imagine the archived sounds and images of the past now that we can resurrect them and give them independent lives? 2 weeks ago, in talking with the point came up that the Screen Actors Guild, for example, is very concerned about this. All the actors from the past being resurrected and turned into someone else's intellectual property. So they certainly have a point of view. But what issues here should concern us? And let's start here with Fran, because you're a dyed-in-the-wool journalist and I'm sure have a take on this.
Yeah, I think, whenever technology develops, it always makes us re-examine ethics and practices. And, I remember working in VR for a long time and having to re-examine, God, what does this mean as a documentarian, as a filmmaker? What is ethical practice? And I think that this is exactly what the Actors Guilds are going through at the moment. What does it mean to be an actor is changing. And, I'm not saying that synthetic media isn't going to be deeply problematic in terms of what acting means for actors, but it does also open possibilities too. And so what I think is needed is like really open discussions between actors about the possibilities of what it ends them, as well as the threats as well. So we actually worked with an actor to produce the synthetic voice, and he was really interested in the technology and what it could afford. But the unions are also very concerned, and I think that what is needed is the dialogue, because as we've seen in other types of technology, it's not really clear cut, and the possibilities of synthetic media are evolving all the time. And so what we need to be doing is considering what those ethical practices mean as we develop what we can use this media for and what the implications are.
Yeah, and I would just add to that really quickly. It's interesting because from our actor's perspective, there's a certain part of him that we've retained and put into our piece, and there's a certain part that we've gotten rid of. And in our case, his performance of the speech, the pacing, the pauses, the pitch arcs, all that stuff was directed by us, and that was reflected in the output. Also, his sort of motion of his lips as he spoke those words was reflected in the output of our piece. But the rest of his face, of course, is not there. That's completely different. So he's sort of hidden in there, but he isn't there specifically, and that is just a new category of the SAG does not have a template for the contract to manage that kind of sort of partial appropriation of performance situation. So it's a very confusing time, and we're trying to all work through this together. And we were appreciative that they were able to make it work for us. So.
I suppose we can expect some codification in the form of legal constraint sooner or later as these social protocols turn into legal ones. I want to pick up on a point that James made in his opening comments about the kind of inherent historicity of deepfakes. The fact that they're based on training sets, that those training sets embody lots of kinds of bias, prejudice. And James, maybe you could just explain a little more to us, like how these training sets work and how this kind of bias plays out. How does it work?
Sure. So training sets are basically collections of images and sounds and words and numbers. They get used as templates for machine learning algorithms to figure out how to produce a convincing synthetic version of whatever's in those training sets. So if we want to create a deep fake, we use a training set of many images of the face of the person in the original video and another with images of the person we want to replace them with. If we want to make fake speech, we have a training set of audio recordings of things a person said and then use that to generate a track in which they say something else. So in a sense, synthetic media takes whatever's in the archive and it uses it to create a fiction. So, I think the kind of fictional nature of the archive in some ways gets amplified through deepfakes. But the question comes up, what happens then when we have a completely fictional archive or an archive that is just a point of view or was kind of contested in the first place? So I spoke earlier about ImageNet, and there we see kind of biased and prejudicial mappings between an image and what it claims to signify. So it's been clearly demonstrated by people like Joy Buolamwini that training sets get used in some cases for like facial recognition. For instance, they have a disproportionate number of white faces in them, which means that when an algorithm sees a face, often it doesn't recognize people of color as a face. In other words, it's kind of amplifying bias. So these things matter hugely. We've had centuries of erasure and lack of representation, discrimination, and unfortunately, we're seeing those things becoming encoded and amplified inside of machine learning technologies.
Great, thanks. Just want to end with one last quickie because I see we have some questions. Folks, send them in if you have them. We do have some in the queue. What should we do with? Should we save these data sets, these training sets? It strikes me that these are really interesting repositories for future historians. They're shaping the kind of fakes we're able to make and the synthetic applications we're making as much as should this be an artifact that archivists are concerned with? Halsey.
I can talk about this a little bit, although I'm definitely not an archivist. So Yvonne, forgive me here for stepping into this territory. But my answer to this is definitely yes. I mean, I think of training sets as cultural, basically as culture of the AI. You're giving them all of this data, just like a baby and kids get all this data when they grow up of what's around them. And that sort of acculturation process happens over many years for, sorry, not sure what's going on. I think we have some technical challenges, but I think you're back, William, which is good. Sorry. So I was just saying that I think of training sets as a form of culture. In fact, they are really the culture of the AI from the AI's perspective. And in that sense, we record our own culture. And I think it's really crucial that we record the culture that we're providing to these AIs. And all of that, as we grow and learn as kids and growing up throughout our lives, we're affected by all this stuff and various biases and things are implanted into us through that. Then I think that same process is happening with the sort of acculturation, if you will, of these artificial intelligence models. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that it is very important to save this culture for the artificial intelligences, just like it is important to save the culture for our fleshy intelligences.
Hear, hear. Makes good sense. I want to invite Kat into the conversation. Kat has access to the question queue and can help link up the audience to you folks. Kat.
Now we have mute issues. Thank you, William. There's a question from YouTube for James about whether why you chose the winners, the warriors, as a point of inspiration. Is it a critique of the film itself?
Well, yeah, there's many reasons for choosing the warriors. The exhibition was in New York City, and is on Lower East Side, which is a traditionally kind of immigrant neighborhood, the kind of original melting pot, which is now going through significant processes of gentrification. And so the audience coming in as a kind of replacement for that kind of collection of people who were around there in the 1970s when the film was made was one point. The other was that the film very clearly delineates a bunch of gangs. Basically, it creates a New York City, which they have these gangs which are based on demographics, identity, and so there's very clearly delineated set of people there to start with. It's also a film that deals with important questions of xenophobia and police brutality and so on. So it seemed like the right kind of vehicle to touch upon many of these issues concerning identity and replacement that I was wanting to explore in the work.
Great, thank you. There's another question from YouTube. Archives in history reflect the thoughts and the beliefs of the winners. In this sense, do you consider deepfakes as a new try for us all to connect with different versions of what reality could be? Maybe start with Fran.
Yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about how deepfakes could be useful in rethinking our history and the narratives that haven't been told. And so I do think that, the archive and the history is very much that of the winners. And we're really, a lot of what we've been thinking about this year is how do we rewrite and rethink those histories and that archive? And I've been thinking about, is there a place for synthetic media to be rewriting some of those narratives? So that's certainly been on my mind about the winners and the losers in archives.
Yvonne, do you have a thought on this? Rewriting history through.
Yeah, just to sort of echo what James was saying earlier in terms of like bias in the training sets. I mean, the output of your algorithm is going to reflect that training set. So, when we're thinking about archives and preservation, like when we think about what we need to archive and what we need to preserve from like a deepfake project, I mean, it is important to consider preserving those training sets so that you can reflect that process of creation and how you got to your result. So, if your archive is meant to, show how something was done or is being used for purposes of accountability, let's say like in how a government makes a decision or something like that, you need to consider what parts of like this a project you need to preserve. So not just the training sets, but maybe also the algorithms, maybe all of the iterations of the algorithm, maybe all of the documentation of all of the decisions that you made, throughout that process, so that, if you need to reproduce that deepfake production process, you're able to do it.
James, what do you think? Rewriting history the right way or right ways through deepfakes?
Yeah. I think to me, it's often a question of visibility here, and archives can tend to be this kind of hidden, like documented thing, and we don't focus on it as much. We tend to focus on the things we can see. And in the case of deepfakes, that's the case. But I would like to see us really concentrating on what these training sets tell us, because I think they reveal a lot. One thing I could tell you from working with many of these kind of algorithms is that, the computer scientists tend to use the same training sets. And one of the most popular ones they use for faces is called Celeb A, which is basically thousands of pictures of celebrities. And so that's what many of these algorithms are being trained on and learning from. And that tells us a huge amount about who we are right now. So archiving something like that would be extremely significant. And you see the bias within something like that on many different levels.
Thank you, James. We're running out of time, but one more question from YouTube. As much as altering archival media and historical records are a concern, what is the level of concern for real-time manipulation and its potential to spark strong public responses or actions? So from archives to real-time and back again. Halsey.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. There's different levels of real-time, but there's, the actual real-time, like me looking different as I'm speaking to you at this moment, which is something that is definitely coming along, both in terms of looking like somebody you aren't and in terms of sounding like somebody you aren't. There are companies that are producing synthetic voices which have, a sub 500 millisecond, latency. So it really enables you to communicate very clearly and very directly and very naturally with somebody using a voice that is not your own voice. And that can be a wonderful thing for gaming and for, sort of creating immersive environments and things like that. It can also be a very, very horrible thing when thinking about the kinds of fraud and the kinds of nefarious activities that could be done with that sort of technology. So, there's nothing any of us can do to stop the sort of inexorable, forward motion of this technology. It will continue to get easier and better and whatnot. So, I think real time is both exciting and scary, and it kind of takes where we are right now to this next level. And it just, hopefully we can prepare right now, right? Not get too scared, but prepare for this kind of upcoming possibility.
I just want to say a quick, speaking of time, we're at the end. I just want to say a quick word of thanks to Yvonne, James, Fran, and Halsey, and flip it back to Kat and Corin.
Great. Thank you, William. And again, thanks to all of the panelists today for a really great discussion. So thanks to James Coop, Yvonne Ng, Francesca Panetta, Halsey Bergand, and to William Maricchio, the moderator. And I'd also like to thank everyone behind the scenes producing the series, all of my colleagues at Witness and at MIT. And we would also like to thank our sponsor, the Knight Foundation, and to BuzzFeed and Vimeo for media support on the series. So with that, I will hand over back to you, Kat, for a heads up on next week's episode of Deepfakery.
Yeah, thanks, Corin. Next week's is episode 6 already. It's at the same time, same place, Thursday at 12 Eastern. And we'll be taking a global look this time at satire, deepfakes, and human rights with Julie Owono, the Executive Director of Internet Without Borders, Evelyn Aswad, the Herman G. Kaiser Chair in International Law at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, moderated by the program director of Witness and one of the driving forces behind this series, Sam Gregory. So till next time, we're going to just exit with a clip of what's coming up next. Thanks so much.
Voilà, je suis le proconsul de France au Cameroun, pardon, l'ambassadeur de France au Cameroun.
Dear people of Belgium, this is a huge deal. As you know, I had the balls to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, and so should you.
My friends, I wish to rise above this divide and endorse my worthy opponent, the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn, to be Prime Minister of our United Kingdom.
Mes chers compatriotes, Gabonaises, Gabonais, avant toute chose, permettez-moi de vous adresser
Les soldats ont pensé, dans leur discours, que la personne qui est venue lire le discours...
Le spectacle désolant de ce discours de Nouvel An à la nation est une honte aux yeux du monde pour notre pays qui a perdu sa dignité.